The Senator from Oklahoma.
Ask unanimous consent that the quorum call in progress be vitiated.
Without objection.
Madam President, I released today a minority staff report of the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works. When Republicans were a majority, I chaired that committee. I'm now the ranking member, a minority member. And we've been concerned for quite some time now that the heavy-handed, the over-regulation that we're getting from the Environmental Public Works Committee is one that is taking its toll on American jobs. So we released this and documented a report that examines the impacts on jobs and the economy from all these EPA rules and EPA regulations. I neglected to ask what the regular order is, and ask unanimous consent that I be recognized as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Okay. And so we're covering 4 areas, and the focus is on the boiler regulations, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or the MAC standards for ozone. We're all concerned about that. I know in the new cement regulations and the endangerment finding. Now, these are just 4 rules that are costing us a lot of jobs, and there are many others that we could be talking about. In fact, we're going to be talking about in the near future such areas that would be standards for cooling water intake structures at power plants, national ambient air quality standards for dust and particulate matter. Actually, they're talking about doing one right now for farm dust. Now, I'm from Oklahoma, and a lot of people back here don't understand that when you grow something, you have to grow it in dirt, and when the wind blows, that's dust. So you can't regulate that, but I think they think they can. The new source performance standards for coal-fired power plants and refineries, and the rules governing disposal of coal combustion waste. So what's that all mean? The American Forest and Paper Association estimates that, and I'm reading now, quoting them, about 24 new regulations being considered by the administration under the Clean Air Act, if all are promulgated, potentially could impose in the order of $17 billion in new capital costs on paper makers and wood product manufacturers in the next 5 years alone. Now, that's just for one industry. So you have all the other industries that will be affected. And before I begin, let me just say that the Clean Air Act was a success. I have always been a supporter of the results of the Clean Air Act. We now have cleaner air. We have from cars, from factories and power plants, and it has been very successful. In fact, when we were a majority and I chaired that committee, we had the 3P regulation, we had the Clear Skies regulations that we tried to promulgate, and so we've been attempting to do this for a long period of time. However, if we're going to be competing with other countries, this over-regulation is going to do nothing but send our jobs to places like China and India and Mexico. Now, the 4 areas I mentioned, the first is the boiler MAC. Now, the MAC means maximum achievable control technologies. Just forget about that. Just call that regulation. The first one, the regulations, would be the boiler. It would impose stringent emission limits on monitoring requirements for 11 subcategories of boilers and process heaters. The proposed rule covers industrial boilers used in manufacturing, processing, mining, refining, as well as commercial boilers used in malls, laundries, apartments, restaurants, and hotels. The Industrial Energy Consumers of America, which represents companies with 750,000 employees, said that they are enormously concerned that the high cost of the boiler regulations will leave companies no recourse but to shut down the entire facility, not just the boilers. Now, this is what the econometrics from IHS Global Insight found in its analysis of the EPA's proposal. That's just the one proposal. They concluded that the proposal could put up to 798,000 jobs at risk. Moreover, they said every $1 billion spent on upgrade and compliance costs will put some 16,000 jobs at risk and reduce the United States GDP by as much as $1.2 billion. Now, the EPA's pending boiler regulations also threaten my home state of Oklahoma. We have a company called Covanta Energy, which in 2008 reopened the Walter B. Hall Resource Recovery Facility from waste to energy. This happened actually when I was mayor of Tulsa many years ago. We had two great needs, one to dispose of waste and the other is to create energy. So we did one of the first waste to energy plants in America was done back in the early 80s when I was mayor of Tulsa. And this is something that has been working out and working successfully, but they're saying that it could threaten this viability of this operation. These concerns that it's not just in my state of Oklahoma, but all over the country, and these concerns shared by 40 of my colleagues, including 18 Democrats, wrote Lisa Jackson, she's the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, a letter, and keep in mind, half of these are Democrats. As our nation struggles to recover from the current recession, we are deeply concerned that the pending Clean Air Act boiler regulations could impose onerous burdens on U.S. manufacturers and leading to the loss of potentially thousands of high-paying jobs this sector provides. As the national unemployment rate hovers around 10% and federal, state, and municipal finances continue to be in dire straits, our country should not be jeopardizing thousands of manufacturing jobs. Again, that's a quote of a letter. Half of them are Democrats, half Republicans, senators, 40 of us, to Lisa Jackson, the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. So just in the area of the boiler regulation, which is just one of four that I'm going to talk about, it was potentially 1 million jobs could be lost. And this is the problem that we're having. The overregulation in this country, we have two major problems. Overregulation, the fact that we're not developing any power anymore. I mean, we've made it so difficult to have, we haven't had a new coal-fired power plant in this country for quite some time, yet China is cranking out 2 of them every week. So this is our competition over there. The second area is the ozone. On January 6th of this year, for the second time in less than 2 years, the EPA proposed to tighten the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, we call it NAAQS standards, for ground-level ozone. Specifically, the EPA is proposing to strengthen the 8-hour primary ozone standard. The EPA estimates that setting the primary standard within its proposed range will cost between $19 and $90 billion. That's the EPA's estimate. This proposal comes at the heels of the 2008 ozone standard, which significantly lowered created a serious problem. The CAA, the Clean Air Act, only requires revision at least every 5 years. Well, that was just 2 years ago. Now they're talking about doing it again. So the EPA is not required to revise the status quo. Meanwhile, states are in the midst of planning to meet the 2008 ozone requirements, and while some communities are not yet in compliance with the 1997 standards, which is the time they did it before. So the EPA recently announced that it is delaying the announcement of the new ozone standards until late October. Well, guess what? We're there. My guess is that they'll be delaying it until after the election because they don't really want to know what hardship they're imposing upon the American people before the election. It's not hard to see why. Whatever level EPA ultimately picks, it will dramatically increase the number of so-called non-attainment areas nationwide. Based on the 2008 air quality data, we could see as many as 608 new non-attainment areas, with many of them highly concentrated in manufacturing regions and states relying on coal for electricity. So what does the non-attainment mean? Well, for local communities, such as my communities in Oklahoma, it can mean loss of industry and economic development, including plant closures, loss of federal highway and transit funding, increased EPA regulation and control over permitting decisions, and increased costs for industrial facilities to implement more stringent controls, and the increased fuel and energy costs. Now, in my state of Oklahoma, at least 15 counties would be found out of attainment. Right now, under the 08, there are 2 counties that would be out of attainment. And all these things would happen. You can't go out and recruit industry. They close down a lot of industries that are there right now. And I have listed in these remarks that will be a part of the record the 15 counties in my state of Oklahoma that could be facing these new restrictions. We all support cleaner air, but here's where the Obama EPA and I disagree. It shouldn't come at the expense of people's jobs or the economy. Apparently, I'm not the only one thinking this way. On October 6, 2010, a bipartisan letter, this is the third one I'm mentioning now, was sent to the EPA administrator on the agency's ozone reconsideration. It was signed by Senators Voinovich, Bai, Lugar, Landrieu, Vitter, McCaskill, and Bonds. That's an equal number of Democrats and Republicans. They said, while we believe we can and should continue to improve our environment, we have become increasingly concerned that the agency's environmental policies are being advanced to the detriment of the people they are intending to protect. That is, these policies are impacting our standard of living by drastically increasing energy costs and decreasing the ability of our states to create jobs, foster entrepreneurship, and give manufacturers the ability to compete in the global marketplace. And that was, again, that was just one of these four areas. The third one would be the Portland cement regulations. This third rule discussed is one of the other maxims, another regulation having to do with cement. According to the EPA, a projected 181 Portland cement kilns will be operating at approximately 100 facilities in the United States by the year 2013. EPA's new emission standards under Section 112 of the Clean Air Act will apply to 158 of that 181. About 7 kilns will be subject to the EPA's new source performance standards under Section 11 of the Clean Air Act. The cement industry is essential to Americans' economy. According to a study by the McGuire Energy Institute at SMU, the cement manufacturing industry in 2008 produced $27.5 billion in GDP, $931 million in direct tax revenues for state and local governments, and sustained 15,000 high-paying jobs. In addition to those 15,000 direct jobs, the industry has now has an induced employment effect which helps create and sustain an additional 150,000 jobs. Importantly, the McGuire Energy Institute noted, and I'm still quoting here, these are primarily high-paying jobs generating about $7.5 billion annually in wages and benefits. According to the Portland Cement Association's EPA's regulation puts up to 18 cement plants at risk of shutting down, threatening nearly 1,800 to 9,000 jobs accordingly. And I might add one of these would be in my state of Oklahoma. These jobs in cement production will go to China, and that's what a professor from King's College in London said about the EPA's rule. This is coming from London. He said, so rather than importing 20 million tons of cement each year, the proposed rule will lead cement imports of more than 48 million tons a year. In other words, by tightening the regulations on United States cement kilns, there will be a risk transfer of some 28 million tons of cement offshore, mostly to China. Senators Voinovich and Lincoln wrote a bipartisan letter to Administrator Jackson sharing these concerns back in February, saying in a very real sense, if a reasonable standard is not adopted in this matter, we anticipate the substantial cement capacity may move overseas to the detriment of the industry and to employment of hundreds of thousands of people in the United States. Now, the fourth one is my favorite because this is the one, to go back and just give a little bit of background. Way back when we had the Kyoto Treaty, and that was back in the 90s, there was an effort at that time to try to say that we have catastrophic things are happening, global warming and all that, as a result of primarily of man-made gases. Well, they tried through the years to pass legislation. We had the 2003 and 2005 McCain-Lieberman bills. Then we had the Markey bills and the others. I think one was the Boxer-Sanders bill. All of them were essentially doing the same thing. It was called cap and trade, called something that was I characterized as the largest tax increase in the history of this country. As a matter of fact, during the consideration of all these bills, they estimated, and this was the several MIT, CRA, and several other institutions said the cost to America would be somewhere between $300 and $400 billion a year. Now, the rule discussed is the endangerment finding. And as I've documented on the Senate floor before, the EPA promulgated its endangerment finding of greenhouse gases in December of 2009, which I said could lead to the greatest bureaucratic intrusion into the lives of American people. It would trigger high, costly, time-consuming permitting requirements for new and modified stationary sources for greenhouse gases, such as power plants, factories, and refineries. So the problem with this is when the Obama administration saw that Congress is not going to pass these very punitive tax increases called cap and trade, that they decided they're going to try to do it through regulation. That's what this is all about. This is just 1/4 of the report, the minority report that we have out there that we introduced today. The rule, in order to do this, and I'll never forget because right before I went over to Copenhagen in December, we had a hearing in the Environment and Public Works Committee, and we had Lisa Jackson. I have a great deal of respect for her before the hearing, and I said, you know, Madam Administrator, I suspect that when I leave for Copenhagen tomorrow, that you're going to have an endangerment finding. Now, an endangerment finding is a finding so that will allow them to promulgate rules to do what they fail to be able to do in legislation. I said, and to do that, it's going to have to be based on some science. What science would that be based on? And she said primarily the science came from the United Nations. And the IPCC is something that has, since that time, has been, ClimateGate has told the truth about how they've been trying to cook the science over that period of time. So this is one that is really, really very serious. But the U.S. Chamber found that if they are able to go ahead and use the emissions, that it would affect 260,000 office buildings, 150,000 warehouses, 92,000 healthcare facilities, 71,000 hotels and motels, 51,000 food service facilities, 37,000 churches and other places of worship, and 17,000 farms. Now, that's because they would be falling under the category of the 250 tons of emissions of CO2 per year. The greenhouse gas regulation will mean higher energy costs for consumers, especially for minorities and the poor. I had the Catholic Charities in my office today, and we had actually a man I learned just died this last week with the Ohio Catholic Charities down for hearings when we were talking about all the things they were trying to do through the various bills, the cap and trade bills. His testimony was, and these individuals who are in our office, my office today, was that it disproportionately hurts poor people. For example, if someone is in poverty, there are just some things that that person has to have. I say heating the home in the winter, transportation costs that are necessary. Now, if you're a wealthy person, that might constitute maybe 5% of your expendable income, but it could be 100% of someone who's poor. So it disproportionately hurts the poor people. And this is why on February 19th, recognizing that it was going to lose a lot of jobs, Senator Rockefeller, joined by 7 of his Democratic colleagues, wrote, again, this is the 4th letter to Administrator Jackson on their concern with the endangerment finding. We write with serious economic and energy security concerns relating to the potential regulation of greenhouse gases from stationary sources under the Clean Air Act. We remain concerned about the possible impacts on American workers and businesses in a number of industrial sectors, along with the farmers, miners, and small business owners who could be affected as your energy agency moves toward the regulations for vehicle greenhouse gas emissions. You know, as bad as things are right now, we were supposed to be able to knock down, and the president said we're going to bring down the unemployment from down to somewhere around 6 or 7%, and it's still right up there at 10%. These regulations haven't even gone into effect yet. And so that is going to cause the unemployment figures to be much higher. And so I think that it's important to recognize right now, before it's too late, something can be done about this overregulation right now. And I really believe that this is the opportunity that we have. And this report that we just released today is on my website, inhofe.senate.gov. And we have now been able to get this around the country so that people know that as bad as the unemployment and the over-regulation is costing American jobs, it could be a lot worse if these 4 regulations get into full effect. I think it's our job here in this chamber to recognize that we have a very, very serious unemployment problem in this country, a very serious over-regulating problem in this country, and we can now do something about it. With that, I'll yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.